Good morning, 10 o'clock. Good to see you. I just suffer through the first two services till you get here because you guys are always just a sight for sore eyes. So good to see you. One person excited about that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We began a series together last week called ZOE. Yes, the answers will be on the chalkboard for the remainder of the quiz. We began a series called ZOE, and what we essentially said last week is that everyone is looking to not just exist, but to have a certain quality of life, to have a certain kind of a life, and that's true whether you're a Christian or not. Everybody's looking for a ZOE life, and ZOE is the word that John, in the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, uses to describe what Jesus came into this world to bring, and the word life is all over the four books that tell us about Jesus, the Gospels. But this word that John uses is this word ZOE, which just means a quality to life, a certain kind of a life. It's not just breathing, it's not just existing. And Jesus is, whether you're Christian or not, or whether you've ever been curious about spiritual things or not, Jesus is a heavyweight in the spiritual conversation, and his voice deserves a spot at the table for anybody looking for life or looking to not just exist, but to have a certain kind of a life. And so we're examining over the course of these 7 weeks, walking towards Easter, the 7 I am statements that Jesus makes. He's given 7 different invitations to life. And last week we talked about anybody remember? The bread. Yeah, one person. Man, why do I do these sermons? Just kidding. I know the rest of you knew the answer, but this week we're talking about the light. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, which is sort of a bold claim to make, and so we're going to look at that in a few moments. I am a passionate fan of any documentary that I see. Anybody else, you get hooked on documentaries or documentary series? A few of you, one person? Yeah, okay. And I love documentaries, and you always wonder what preachers do throughout the week. I mean, we only work 1 day a week, so... which I always tell people, we have Saturday night services, which means I work 2 days a week. Just kidding. Yeah, Harry and I, we stay here at the church, and we have bunk beds upstairs, and we, so awkward. I love to watch documentaries. I can watch a documentary about anything, whether it's war, whether it's food, and I've seen 2 in the last couple of weeks. One is a documentary called Tom vs. Time on Tom Brady. Anybody seen Tom vs. Time? Yeah, you liked it? It was good? Yeah, well, are you a Tom Brady fan? Now you're a Tom Brady fan? That's great. Anybody else seen it? One passionate fan of Tom vs. Time? Anybody else seen it? That's good, because if you are a Tom Brady fan, you really need Jesus in your life. But I'm going to say that. I know, it's just... Okay, the rest of you. You don't have to be a Tom Brady fan to watch Tom vs. Time. I'm fine with Tom vs. Time. I'm not fine with Tom vs. the Falcons. Tom has unbelievable life, obviously. Everything you could ever possibly want. He's got 5 Super Bowl rings, 4 of which count. He's got... I don't know where the sermon's going today. Just off the rails. Brazilian supermodel wife, multi-million-dollar house. And in this documentary, it's 6 parts to it. And you remember this. It has the emotional game is one part, but there's also a chapter that's called the spiritual game. And it's all about the interior life of Tom Brady. And one of the things that you realize is that for him, the ZOE life, the life that he has, comes from the structure of football. And he craves that structure, the 16-game season, the rigorous diet that he has to put himself through to prepare his body at 40 years old for the season, the structure of the season, the structure of the game, the rules of football. In fact, at one point in the spiritual game section of this documentary, he says that football is just synonymous with his being, that it's just who he is, that to go out and play in front of 70,000 people is a form of meditation for him, that it's so in his bones, and that he says the structure, the context of football in his mind creates the context for miracles, and that there's something about the game and that structure that it brings into his life. And that's sort of part of the documentary. He's competing against time, because the moment the game goes away, he's sort of wrestling with, what does it even mean to be human? What does it mean to have life? Because for him, life, the ZOE life, is in the structure of football. I watched another documentary. It was actually an episode of Chef's Table. Any Chef's Table fans here? A few of you. Do you get hungry after every one you watch? Me too, man. I just, it will revolutionize your evenings watching Chef's Table and your pantry. It's just great. But I watched one on this celebrity chef a couple of weeks ago, or I saw it last week. It was called, or it was an episode on a guy named Francis Mallman. I don't know if anybody knows who Francis Mallman is, but this is a picture of Francis Mallman. Francis Mallman, yeah, I love the, yeah, there he is. That's him taking communion. But he just takes communion the whole episode. But Francis Mallman, on the other extreme of Tom Brady, is all about freedom. That for him, essentially, he articulates that the best life is found in the rejection of rules, the rejection of structure. He lives on this isolated island in the middle of the Patagonia where he just does what he wants. He drinks wine for breakfast. He eats crepes, I think 3 meals a day. He's had 6 kids by 4 different women, and they really romanticize the freedom that he's experienced in his life. And just on the other extreme, that freedom is found in rejecting structure and rules. And I think for every single one of us in this room, one of those two will light you up. One of those will be the way that you experience life. For some of us, you need structure, you need rules, you crave that. I mean, you need to know who you're eating lunch with 2 weeks from today. I mean, there's just this structure that's rigorous in your life. Others of us, you reject that, and you have a little more Francis Mallman in your spirit. You love to just be a free spirit. In fact, when you were growing up, everybody said that about you in your sorority. People said that about you at your school. You know, she's just a free spirit. And I think for most of us, we're constantly trying to navigate that sort of tricky relationship between freedom and structure in our lives. You navigate that tricky relationship as a parent. Teaching your kids, you're free to be who you want. You're free to do what you want with your life. But in the meantime, you need some structure and rules. There needs to be homework that gets done. You try to navigate that relationship between freedom and structure in your diet. When you eat, you know, you want to be free to eat what you want, when you want. But you know, to be healthy, there's sort of a, there needs to be some structure in terms of what you eat, when you eat. And then you have that, some of us, you have that sort of, I'm going to have a cheat day or maybe a cheat year where you're just going to kind of eat what you want. But you need that freedom and you need that structure. And there's that tricky relationship that's constantly at play between the two. And Jesus is going to make a claim. He's going to make a statement that on the surface sounds unrelated from freedom and structure, but it actually has everything to do with this tricky dance that we're constantly always playing between the Tom Brady on one shoulder and the Francis Mallman on the other of freedom and structure in our lives. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1. We're going to get to John in just a moment, and we're going to look at this claim that Jesus makes where he says, I am the light of the world. That's the claim we're looking at today. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. But as we said last week, the whole thing really kicks off in Genesis. And John is telling us this new story, but it's deeply connected to the old story that gets told in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is how the entirety of the scriptures begin. If you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens, or you can download the CRB app and you can follow along there as well. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be what? Let there be light. He spoke light into existence, and there was light. So Genesis begins with God, Father, Son, Spirit, creating, speaking light into existence. Turn with me a few thousand years to the right, the book of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. John chapter 1, notice how John begins his story. John 1, starting in verse 1. In the beginning. Have you heard these words before? Of course. What is John doing? He's essentially saying, I'm going to tell you a new story, deeply connected to the old story. Genesis tells you how you receive breath, how you receive life. Jesus is going to come to not just tell you how to receive breath, but how to actually have a certain kind and quality of life. He's drawing a line between Genesis and Jesus. He's telling us about a new creation because the old creation has a death problem, and we need a certain kind of life. We need Easter, essentially. John 1, verse 1, in the beginning, was the Word. This is Jesus. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life. This is the ZOE life, the quality of life, not just breathing, not just existing. And the life was the, what's the word? The light, yes. So he's deeply connecting the old story to the new story. And in a few moments, Jesus is going to stand up because John builds his story around what's these 7 I am statements that Jesus makes. And if you remember from last week, I am is another name for God. It's just God's name. He says, I am. And Jesus makes these 7 I am statements. Last week, I am the bread. In a few moments, in John chapter 8, he's going to say, I am the light, which is a bold, extravagant claim. And this is the reason why you'll have friends who say, I have no problem with Jesus. He's just a good moral teacher. Jesus is great. I follow some of the things that Jesus says. But the problem is, Jesus didn't claim to be a good moral teacher. Jesus claimed things like, I am the light of the world. He doesn't claim to be a moon. He doesn't claim to point to the light. He says, no, I am the light. It's a powerful claim. Now, what's amazing about what Jesus says, I am the light of the world, is not just that he said it, but where he says it. If you're reading this story for the first time, for the original audience of John, or for the people that are in the crowd when he makes this claim, what's shocking is where this claim takes place. This claim takes place at something that's called the Feast of the Tabernacles, or the Festival of the Tabernacles, because all the way back in the old story, God has commanded that the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, celebrate, have 8 festivals on their calendar. 7 times a year, they would take several days off of work, and they would celebrate, they would party, and God has commanded them to do this. Notice what these festivals are laid out in Leviticus chapter 23. Notice what God says in Leviticus 23 when he's describing these festivals. Verse 30, I will destroy from among their people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. God essentially says, party or die. That's the command. How many of you got in trouble by your Christian mom for throwing parties at the house? This could have been your life verse right there. Just doing what the Bible says there. So God has commanded 7 times a year. Now, 4 of the festivals take place in the spring. Passover is one of these festivals. 3 of the festivals take place in the fall. The Feast of the Tabernacles is the last of the fall festivals that God has commanded you to participate in, and it would take place somewhere around the month of October. And the festival, or the Feast of the Tabernacles, it's a way to remind yourself and to remember that God delivered your ancestors out of slavery, out of bondage in Egypt, into your homeland, into the nation of Israel. And this festival, it's 8 days long. God has commanded them every year to do this. And it's a bit like Easter meets Christmas meets July 4th, all kind of rolled into one at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now, there are 3 focal images at the Feast of the Tabernacles. And this sounds sort of bizarre to us, but we do the same thing when we have celebrations and we have traditions. At Christmas, we have focal images of Christmas trees, candy canes, elves, whatever it is, Will Ferrell movies, whatever. And the same is true for the Feast of the Tabernacles. There's 3 focal images. One is water, and it's to remind you that in the old story, the Exodus story, your ancestors wandered in the wilderness and they would have dehydrated and died had Moses not struck a rock and water come out of it. And so it's to remind you. And so on the last day of the Feast of the Tabernacles, people would pour out water, they'd pour out wine. There'd be sort of this reminder. Water is a focal image in their story. Another focal image is tents. Tents would be everywhere. And unlike going to Mexico, it's not glamping in these tents, by the way. These tents are to remind you that although in the first century world you have a homeland, you have Israel, your ancestors did not. You have a permanent dwelling. They wandered the wilderness in tents looking for Israel, and God was leading them along the way. There is also another focal image, and it's the image of light. And obviously there's not electricity, so this would be fire, and this would be everywhere. at the Feast of the Tabernacles. They're all sort of crammed into Jerusalem. And this light is to remind you that while you were wandering in the wilderness, your ancestors were wandering in the wilderness, when they wanted to move or they needed to move to a new location, God would come in the form of a pillar of fire and would move, and they would say, the glory of God has moved, and they would move with it. And this is to remind you that for your ancestors and for you, God is your light, God is your guide, God is the one that you're following every step of your journey. So there's fire, there's tents. Apparently no one's concerned about a fire code at this festival of the tabernacles. In the temple, there would be 3 candelabras, 75 feet in the air, that they would light at night for these 8 days. And they would emanate light all throughout the city because the whole sort of festival is taking place around the temple. So this is the Feast of the Tabernacles, 3 focal images: light, tents, and water. Now, if you have a bunch of pilgrims and a bunch of people who've come in from out of town to stay at this particular festival, which is sort of like Burning Man meets Easter meets Woodstock. I mean, and if you have people who've come in from out of town, they're staying in tents, they're partying, they're staying up late, listening to music, drinking wine, is it possible that some married people might do some things that they regret in the morning? Yes, of course. Of course it is. In the middle of the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Pharisees have caught a woman in a very interesting situation, and they want to know what Jesus is going to do about it. Turn with me to John chapter 8, verse 1 is where we find ourselves. So a little backdrop on what's going on, where they are, what's been happening for a few days around this story. Verse 1, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. She had been sneaking out of the tents. They made her stand before the group. And they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses," so they've been taught that life comes through obeying the law, the old story. And the law of Moses says if somebody's caught in adultery, they can be stoned for this. In the law of Moses, it commands us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? And Jesus is this upstart preacher who's talking about compassion, grace, freedom, and they have him in this tension that we all feel every single day. Is it law, structure, rules? Is it freedom, grace, do what you want? What is it, Jesus? Now, what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. So the law states, and the law was sort of tricky on this, but if you were caught in adultery, according to the ancient story, if you're caught in adultery, you can be stoned to death for this. Now, it was a really hard law to enforce, and it almost never was, because you had to have 2 witnesses to enforce it, which sort of raises the question when you read this, then where's the guy in the whole story? But that's not really the point. They're just trying to trap Jesus in this particular moment. And Jesus upholds the law. Jesus teaches the law. He's a rabbi. He certainly abides by the law, or at least he says at some point, I haven't come to abolish it. I'm here to fulfill it, help it achieve its purpose. But at the same time, he's teaching about compassion and grace. He's teaching about freedom. He's teaching about, and they're saying, well, what are you going to do? There's sort of this Tom Brady, Francis Mallman tension. Which one are you going to choose? And every single one of us in this room, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a spiritual person or not, we are all constantly making spiritual decisions about when we should enforce the rules or when we should give compassion and grace to somebody. You're constantly making spiritual decisions. At work, some of us, you made a decision this morning on your way to church when somebody cut you off on the 15. Am I going to enforce the rule and honk the horn and scream? Or am I going to give them compassion and grace? You're constant. That happened to anybody in the parking lot? Just curious. That was me, sorry. There's this constant, you're constantly having to make spiritual decisions. Is this the appropriate moment to enforce the rule, or should I give compassion and grace? You feel this tension as a parent. You feel this tension at work when someone does something that they shouldn't do. Are we going to enforce the rule, or are we going to give compassion and grace? And if you lean too hard in one direction or another, it's a tricky dance that's constantly at play in your life and in mine. If you lean too hard in one direction or the other, you undercut the ability for somebody to grow, learn. If you lean too hard in the direction of compassion and grace as a parent, or as an employer or anything, you end up relativizing morality and saying nothing really matters and there are no standards. If you end up leaning too hard in the direction of rules and enforcing the rules and absolute morality, and this is the way that it has to be, then you end up crushing people, including yourself, because you can never live up to the standards that you expect. And there's this constant tension. When do we give compassion and grace? And when do we enforce the rules? This tension sits at the heart of the American political system. This tension sits at the heart of your relationship to your kids as you raise your kids. Is this a moment, and some of us, you find yourself in this argument with your spouse. He wants to give compassion and grace, you want to enforce the rules, and there's this tension. When your daughter, when your son has been caught doing something they shouldn't, you feel this tension in your own life when you do something that you shouldn't. Do I deserve compassion and grace, or should I have the rule book thrown in my direction? There is this constant tricky dance between these two. And notice what Jesus does. He is so brilliant in the way that he approaches this particular moment. It says, but Jesus bent down, verse 6, and started to write on the ground with his finger, which I just love that detail, by the way. It's sort of like he's bored with the whole festival. And it says that they keep on questioning him, the Pharisees, what are you going to do? And he straightens up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And I imagine in that moment a bunch of stones hit the ground. Again, he stooped down, I love this, and he wrote on the ground. He's not even going to give them eye contact in that moment, apparently. I love what Jesus is doing. He's navigating brilliantly this tricky relationship between freedom, grace, rules, morality. Essentially what he's doing in this moment is he's saying to the Pharisees, I'm not denying the law of Moses. I'm not rejecting structure, rules, that there has to be a sort of moral framework that we live by. I'm not denying the law of Moses. I am denying by the law of Moses that you're qualified to enforce it. And if you want to pick up a stone and throw it in her direction, then everybody gets to pick up a stone this afternoon and throw it in each other's direction. He's not saying in this moment that only perfect people can punish people. He's not saying in this particular moment that if you've been caught red-handed doing something that you shouldn't do, that you should just sort of dig up the dirty laundry on your accusers and sort of point fingers. He's not even saying in this moment that this woman shouldn't suffer some kind of a punishment for what she's done. What he is saying in this moment, essentially, and I love this, he's saying, look, I know you guys. And if you want to pick up a stone and throw it in her direction, then everybody gets to pick up a stone, and it's going to get really bloody on this particular afternoon. And he's navigating brilliantly this relationship and this tension that we all feel between freedom, grace, and rules and morality. And I love what happens next. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. Isn't that great? The older ones first, which I love that John includes that detail. It's like the older ones are a little bit smarter, and they just, I imagine there's still some young, angry Pharisees just holding the rock, kind of. But in this moment, it says that they're still walking away with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, woman, where are they? Which is sort of a joke. Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. What a scene, Jesus said. No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. And the very next sentence that Jesus says, this very next line out of his mouth is what? When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Sort of a bizarre thing to say in light of the theater that they just witnessed. When Jesus spoke again, he said to the people, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life, the light of this ZOE. Sort of odd, seems disconnected. But what does light do? Here in this moment, you have the Pharisees who want to put the light right on her. And Jesus is, in this particular moment, not going to kill her and crush her with light. What does light do? Light really has two primary functions. We could talk all day about the different qualities of the things that light can do, but really you boil it down, there's two things light can do, at least in terms of how it applies for us. Light can either disturb you or it can comfort you. Think about the morning when you wake up, you've been sleeping, and you turn on the light. What happens immediately? You squint. There's this, it disturbs you. Then you go into the bathroom and you see yourself in the light. That's even more disturbing in that moment, isn't it? Light disturbs. A couple nights ago, Ezra, our 1-year-old, was screaming, shrieking in the middle of the night. And so Rosanna, we run in there, we turn on the light, and he stops crying. Why? Because light can bring comfort. It either comforts or it disturbs. At a macro level, what happens if you get too close to light? It can kill you. It can actually burn you up. At another level, if you don't have light, if we don't have sunlight, there's no crops, there's no food, and we all die. We're constantly navigating a tricky relationship with light, aren't we? Somewhere between comfort and disruption. Too much light, too little light, good or bad. Jesus makes this claim, I am the light of the world, after this particular theater. Essentially, the reason he makes that claim is because what has he done? He has comforted this woman who is disturbed, and he's disturbing the Pharisees who are incredibly comfortable. Because that's what light does. It either comforts or it disturbs. And in this particular moment, this woman is disturbed and she needs comforting. And the Pharisees are comfortable with the stone in their hand, as we often are, and he's going to disturb them in their righteousness. Nothing will ever make you feel as spiritual as when you pick up a stone and you aim it at somebody else. There is something about having a stone in your hand, whether you're a Christian or not, that makes you feel incredibly comfortable and righteous. You don't even have to pray. You don't even have to read the Bible. You just have to decide that someone else is wrong because of something that they've done. That group of people are wrong, or that individual is wrong, and find a little shred of moral high ground to stand on, and you can get really comfortable with a stone in your hand in that particular moment. As a society, we entertain ourselves this way, don't we? It's a vulture culture, constantly trying to catch somebody, constantly. Every time you watch the news, there's another there's another story, and in someone else's wrongness, we can start to feel so right, and it gets so comfortable holding a stone in our hand. And if you've gotten incredibly comfortable holding a stone, Jesus disturbs the comfortable. And he essentially is going to take the light that we want to point on someone else, and he's going to point it back on us. We seem so concerned with the spiritual condition of someone else, and he essentially says, what about you? In this moment, this woman is incredibly disturbed. And the reason is because everyone's throwing a stone at her. Some of us in the room, you've been the one that people have thrown stones at. You were the one that after the divorce, you were the one that in your town, when you did whatever it was that you did, you were the one that everybody got really comfortable throwing a stone in your direction. Does anybody have any church scars? You know what I'm talking about? Where you were the one that was gossiped about. You were the one that because of a behavior, because of a choice, everybody got really comfortable picking up a stone. And some of us today, you go through life with some wounds of what some moral, sort of self-righteous, throwing them in your particular direction. And to you, Jesus says, I am the light, and I comfort those that are disturbed, because that's what light does. Now notice, Jesus is not going to let her off the hook and say, hey, no big deal, go back to doing whatever you were doing. In fact, he's going to draw her in but hold her feet to the fire. I love this. The very last line, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. So he's not saying, just go back and do whatever you want to do. No, Jesus is saying, this is how grace works. Grace is the light that gets shown on us so we can begin to grow and we can begin to actually have a certain kind of a life that condemnation cannot bring into our lives. And grace, the grace of Jesus says, you are guilty. I see who you are. I know exactly what's going on, but you are not condemned. And it's through the grace of God alone that we can actually begin to have life. Condemnation cannot bring that. Somebody judging you, criticizing you, throwing a stone in your direction cannot bring that. Only the grace and the light of Jesus Christ can bring that kind of a life. And he says, I am the light. And I'm not the kind of light who's going to get in such a way that's so intense that it's going to burn you, because that kills, that destroys. He's not the kind of light that says grace, freedom means that it doesn't really matter and, I'm not even going to look. Just do what you want to do, because that doesn't cultivate life either. He's the kind of light that says, I see exactly who you are. I know exactly what you've done, and I choose to not condemn. And now, go and live a life free of sin. Now, go and be changed, because you have experienced the grace and the light of Jesus Christ. That's a whole different approach to failure. That's a whole different approach to morality. Grace says, I see exactly who you are, and you are not condemned. If the light's too close, it kills life. If the light's too far away, and the light of Jesus Christ, the grace of Jesus Christ, comes into our lives for the purpose of growth, life, so we can be this new creation that he's called us to be. And he says, I am the grace, I am the light of the world. And that actually begins to free you to be a different kind of person in a different way, to actually begin to stand up in your failures, to not hide, to not try to just step out of the light, get the light off of you, but to say, I am fully seen by Jesus. I am fully seen by God. And I'm loved. That's the grace, and that's the light that we're invited into, and that's the light that gives ZOE and the light that gives life. Jonathan Edwards, the famous preacher from the 17th century, one of the original revivalists in American history, he says that there's two kinds of virtue. There's two kinds of being good, essentially. One kind is called common virtue. And common virtue is when the heart is restrained. And it appeals to fear and pride that if you put enough rules in place, then you can teach anybody to be good. And if you violate the rules, and some of us, you've experienced this, if I violate the rules, then there's a social consequence to that. There's some kind of stigma that goes with it. And so through fear and by appealing to pride, you can restrain the heart. It's called common grace. He says, but what Jesus has come to bring, his grace has come to bring, is true virtue, true goodness in our lives, where the heart is not restrained, but the heart is actually changed. Where we're not spending our time trying to stuff down and hide the things about us that we don't, that are not good, but we're actually changed. And the grace of Jesus, it doesn't appeal to fear and pride. The grace of Jesus, when you are seen exactly as you are and not condemned, it disintegrates fear and pride. And common virtue will always look at the rules, and true virtue looks at the ruler, and the ruler who says, I am the light, I see you exactly as you are, and you are not condemned. That grace actually begins to bring life. It begins to cultivate life. For some of us today, maybe you've had stones thrown in your direction. And Jesus says, I am the light. I will come and comfort you. I will draw you in, but I will hold your feet to the fire. And grace demands that you don't stay the same, that you begin to grow and change, and you begin to have a certain kind of a life in Jesus that begins in grace. At the same time, if you've gotten comfortable throwing stones in somebody's direction, it feels so good and so comfortable. Jesus comes and says, I am the light. And instead of being concerned with someone else's spiritual condition, let's talk about yours. And he applies the light to us so that we can begin to grow and change. We're going to take the elements of communion together, the bread and the cup. And if you're a follower of Christ, we invite you to come forward and to receive these elements. And as we take these today, How is grace changing you? How is the light changing you? How is the light of Christ disintegrating fear and pride in your life? If you